Okay, so about a month ago, Tim Pool hosted a discussion between whatifalthist and Scott Greer about whether or not America is going to have a civil war. For those of you who've been living under a rock and you don't know who Tim Pool is basically an independent journalist who rose to prominence during Occupy Wall Street. He filmed Occupy Wall Street. Now, I guess you could say he's like a moderate in the political space on YouTube, and he hosts a podcast. Whatifalthist? I've done videos on him before. He is a YouTuber who has an interest in history, who has some ideas I disagree with. Scott Greer is also someone I tend to disagree with. He is basically, I guess you would call him like a pseudo pro-white advocate. He's not very extreme, but you can tell that he feels out of place in the current American landscape, cultural landscape, where I guess white males are losing cultural dominance. And anyway, the video I am talking about in this, I'm reviewing, is one in which Tim Pool hosted Scott Greer and whatifalthist discussing whether or not there's going to be a civil war in the United States. With Scott Greer arguing there will not be in the next year, and whatifalthist arguing there will be. Both of these people basically hold very similar political views, but what's interesting is what I believe drives Scott Greer to argue there will not be a civil war, and whatifalthist arguing there will be. And it just reinforces my conclusion that whatifalthist is not as great as people think it is. Fundamentally, I think the reason why whatifalthist believes there will be a civil war and Scott Greer believes there will not be a civil war is because Scott Greer is much, his ideas and his philosophy and his view of history and politics is much more rooted in reality. With whatifalthist, he's much more abstract, and it's his ideas of history and philosophy in society is much more theoretical. And the reason for this is because whatifalthist is fundamentally what I believe to be antisocial and less attractive. You can tell this is someone who sympathizes with people like sympathizes with men on the outskirts of society because he himself exists on the fringes of society, on the outskirts of society. He's not very attractive. He's not very well spoken. You can tell he spends a lot of time by himself and books and like online and stuff. This is directly in contrast with Scott Greer. Scott Greer, he is very well kept. He is what you could be considered traditionally, like he is what we would traditionally be described as handsome. He's well spoken. He seems to be from an upper middle class background. He's college educated. I believe it was like Ivy League or like second rate Ivy League educated. So you can see there's a giant contrast between these two. Scott Greer is also a little older. There's a contrast between these two. And Scott Greer, his ideas are much more rooted in reality, whereas whatifalthist, I think fundamentally he wants there to be a civil war because he feels out of place in society. He feels weak and defenseless. And he wants there to be a civil war because he fundamentally believes there's no place for him in modern American society. Whereas Scott Greer, I think he mostly just feels out of place because of the current cultural, white males, white people in general, white Americans are losing cultural dominance in American society. He feels out of place because of that, and he's a conservative. I don't think he's a traditionalist. I think he's just like a moderate conservative Republican. He's probably a conservative because he believes it would create a more orderly society. Whereas whatifalthist, I believe he's more of an authoritarian. Both of them seem to be a little hostile to immigrants and those of like different cultural and racial backgrounds. But I think for different reasons. I think Scott Greer, he views these people as like intrusive, whereas I believe What About His views himself to be fundamentally inferior to them. And he deals with this inferiority complex by projecting a sense of superiority. And he develops this sense of superiority around himself by surrounding himself with the quote unquote great deeds of like Western history and stuff and Western culture. But fundamentally, this comes from a position of weakness. He's obsessed with history and Western history, quote unquote Western history, if that even exists, because he fundamentally isn't really that great. And he builds his identity around Western history because fundamentally, I believe he knows he's someone who is not very impressive in the modern world.